The travel agent's doors opening for the final time today. As Mark had stepped through the doors, the final agents had been seated, shivering as the cold environment had invaded the air inside. Mark had taken a seat down and proceeded to inquire about his trip down to Hawaii, booking tickets for the evening tomorrow. The deal was settled, and what was to come no person could predict. As he stepped outside in shivering cold, as the snow had drooped down dramatically, and had increased as the wind had caused the space more difficult to see. Mark's confused steps had led him away from the footpath onto the street, where he clumsily made his way to a taxi, well to a occupied one as he trampled the women inside. He was met with force, with a thrust forcing him back onto the sidewalk, where a fellow pedestrian had run the tips of his fingers over, but a miraculous walk home, and with a sniffling nose had turned the light on but no spark. He could feel the sickness crawling inside him now, as his house was now a somewhat warmer environment than the great outdoors. The flashlight on his phone had allowed a limited view as he had headed upstairs and had retrieved the dusty suitcase from on top of his simple closet. Whatever clothes were on the rack were stuffed into the dusty travel box. No power had delayed any thorough packing. Once the essentials had been packed, Mark had headed towards the bed, his nose now starting to dribble, and as he lay his mind had wandered. One last day, Mark had thought, and then off he was headed, far from the ruralness of Alice Springs to the sweet reserves of Hawaii, where his sweet desires will have been met. But the difficulty of sleep was no mystery to Mark, but today it was something else. As he would doze off, he would spring back into the quiet emptiness of his now powerless house. As Mark had dozed for the one last time and woke, stiff the next morning at 10. He was already late for work. Mark had grabbed his suitcase and rushed off to work. The clock, now coming a close tick to 6, had finally marked the end of hard working, and was now time to gain his rewards. As he headed out, his boss had asked him to stay, but Mark had heeded nothing to his words. Ignorance is a man's greatest weakness, as it could sow nothing but more trouble for the man. The entrance to the airport had seen Mark rushing to the terminal. As he approached security guards, his pockets were empty. His plane ticket and passport were not even to be seen in the day bag. Mark's mind could not help but flash back to the many possible locations, and the one that was most relevant was now the place he had dreaded. But would the hour trip bring him back in time? But it was a risk he had to undertake. The cabs outside the taxi had escorted Mark back to the general store he had just left at what felt like moments ago. The store had seemed to close early. His tickets and passport sat neatly on the empty shelf. Mark had puffed as he had grabbed his phone, now almost dead, and called the manager, but to no response. The repeating voicemail after each attempt had made his blood boil over, and irritated, Mark had kicked a rock, and with now 2 hours left before his flight, the light bulb flickered reluctantly above his head. The rock had weighed his arm, but the free-flowing throw was enough to impact the glass as the driver had looked on, scared to be in the vicinity. But Mark had persevered, and now this adventure would be the only thing saving him. The job was now done, and now the trip back to the airport was feeling longer, as the time had been slipping out of his hand. The rush to the terminal had gotten the adrenaline rushing, as he had shook when he stood still. When permitted in, Mark was glad to be safely within the airport. These moments of happiness hadn't lasted long, and people on the plane were going to increase as 2 major families filled to the brim with kids were entering in, loud and ignorant of the surrounding before them. The calling for the plane had begun, and as they had all piled on, the seats had been filled and no space on the plane. And where was a man to go now? And waiting was no longer an option. The idea of the bathroom was great, and was the only option. Mark had hidden there as the plane had lifted off, and no one could snatch the dreams of the sweet Hawaii dream. As Mark had headed out of the bathroom, an empty seat had lingered in his eyes as he headed towards it. The kid next to the empty seat had eyed him cautiously, as to scare this guy not to sit down. But as Mark makes his preparations to take the seat, the kid bites him, and Mark rouses the public with his scream. Worried people had turned their heads, and the flight attendants had rushed down to test the problem. The kid was quick to accuse Mark of assaulting him, and the rest of the people looking on with worried looks. The dad had returned to claim his empty seat from the child abuser. One look from the commotion, and the dad had understood what was going on, as well as the crocodile tears made by the kid. The plane had begun to shake violently in the air as the people standing had braced themselves. The onlookers were now worried with the overflowing and condensed events taking place. The dad's face had still been locked onto the protagonist as he now worries about where he will sit. But enough was enough, and no more time had passed this when the beast of the dad was released. The fury of the fist had been enough to knock Mark down with a crack in his as the plane shook again, giving his body some air time. His nose had now bled and his mind had felt mucky and unorganized. Maybe this holiday wasn't such a good choice after all. The plane had now shook a third time, and the suitcase with Mark had now no sense of self-control, as it had tripped the dad, causing the oxygen masks to dispense from their places as the plane had now a descending vibe as the unconscious body of Mark had slipped to the front along with the dad's as the people had worried. The frightened flight attendant at the front had opened the door with a parachute landing over the vast ocean. The not-so-conscious Mark had followed the same fate, but without a parachute along with the dad as he grasped onto nothing attempting to save himself. Mark had landed in the ocean with a thud, and the whereabouts of the plane are still nowhere to be found. Neither was Mark. He was declared dead as no traces of the body could be found. All that could be found was the stale and dirty and somehow empty suitcase, bobbing in the great Pacific. The end. Not my best, but I tried.